If you want to make someone crave your presence, genuinely crave it like a drug, you need to understand something foundational about human psychology. People are magnetized not to chaos, but to mystery. There's a difference. Chaos repels over time, while mystery draws in. Now, this isn't about playing games or pretending to be someone you're not. It's about developing a kind of internal richness that can't be consumed in one sitting. See, when you become emotionally available and psychologically layered, you offer something rare, something he can't decode at first glance. And that's where desire begins. Let me put it plainly. Predictability kills passion. If he always knows exactly how you'll respond, where you'll be, what you'll say, and how you'll feel, he stops exploring. He stops reaching. He becomes passive. But when you're composed, emotionally centered, yet somehow just out of reach in your full essence, it creates a subtle tension, not confusion, not manipulation. Tension, that space between what is and what could be. That's what people remember. That's what becomes addictive. Most women have been conditioned to believe that vulnerability means pouring themselves out immediately, oversharing, over-explaining, over-justifying. And this is done in the hope that it builds intimacy. But what it actually does, psychologically speaking, is erode intrigue. It flattens the dynamic. Intimacy doesn't come from exposure. It comes from resonance, from the other person slowly discovering the complexity within you if they have the depth to see it. And when a man begins to feel that he has to earn that access, he becomes invested. This kind of mystery isn't superficial. It's not about being quiet or distant. It's about being internally fascinating. It's about thinking deeply, living richly, feeling intentionally. When you operate from that place, your energy doesn't scream, "Pick me!" It calmly declares, "I know who I am." That's not intimidating. That's magnetic. A woman who brings both presence and enigma into a room doesn't have to demand attention. She naturally commands it. Now, let's not confuse mystery with emotional unavailability. The goal isn't to withhold love. It's to give love wisely, generously, but selectively. A man should feel that your attention is meaningful, not automatic, because when something is automatic, it's not valued. What's scarce gets noticed. What's earned gets treasured. In many ways, men test for mystery the same way children test for structure. They press boundaries, not because they want to escape, but because they want to know there are boundaries. They ask questions, not always with words, but with behaviors. They want to know, is there something deeper in her? Is there a world within her I haven't yet explored? And when they find that world, it creates emotional gravity. He doesn't just want your time. He wants your presence, your attention, your essence. He wants to be near the thing he hasn't quite figured out. And that is where craving begins. You don't need to contort yourself or shrink to keep a man. You simply need to stop giving all of yourself to someone who hasn't shown the capacity to receive it. You don't owe full access to someone who hasn't earned it. When you preserve part of yourself, not out of fear, but out of self-respect, you become a riddle he wants to solve rather than a textbook he's already finished. So if you're wondering why some women are unforgettable, it's not because they were loud or needy or constantly present. It's because they offered a depth that couldn't be fully mapped. They were available, but never fully possessed. They created room for him to reach, and in doing so, made themselves irreplaceable. And here's the bottom line. If you want him to crave your presence like a drug, stop trying to convince him of your worth. Live in such a way that he feels it, even in your silence. Let that echo. Let's talk about presence, the kind that doesn't demand attention but naturally draws it. In a world saturated with noise, what stands out is not the loudest voice but the most grounded one. If you want to make a man crave your presence, you have to stop centering him in your emotional orbit and start anchoring yourself. Because here's the paradox. When a woman becomes the center of her own world, she becomes the gravitational pull in everyone else's. That's not arrogance, that's power, rooted in self-possession. You have to ask yourself, what does your energy say when you walk into a room? Not the way you look, not what you're wearing, your energy. Because presence isn't posture, it's a state of being. It's when a woman is so deeply attuned to herself, so invested in her own growth, her own interests, her own inner world, that anyone in her proximity feels like they've stepped into something significant. She's not rushing to prove her worth. She's not scrambling for approval. She knows who she is, and that confidence is disarming. Now, this kind of energy can't be manufactured. You can't fake being whole. You can mimic traits, sure, but real presence comes from doing the inner work. It comes from healing the parts of yourself that believe love must be earned through performance. It comes from letting go of the compulsion to entertain or please in order to feel seen. That's where craving is born. Not in performance. When a man feels that he can't shake the feeling of being near you, not because you gave him everything, but because you were everything without needing him. Think of it like this. Emotional independence is not the absence of desire. It's the refusal to be defined by it. When you live from a place of purpose, when your days are full, not because you're trying to be busy, but because you're living deeply engaged in things that matter to you, you become harder to access, not out of strategy, but out of reality. You're occupied. You're not waiting. You're not chasing. You're creating. And creation is magnetic. Men don't crave women who orbit them. They crave women who orbit something larger than them. A mission, a passion, a vision for life. What's fascinating here is the psychological dynamic this creates. When you're emotionally anchored, you remove the subconscious burden that many women place on men to validate them, to reassure them, to complete them. And the moment that burden lifts, he stops seeing you as a responsibility and starts seeing you as a privilege. The very absence of neediness becomes intoxicating. There's also something deeply spiritual about presence. It's not just about confidence, it's about alignment. When your thoughts, your values, and your actions are integrated, your energy becomes clean. People feel it. They may not articulate it, but they respond to it. And men, especially men who are emotionally intelligent, are not drawn to chaos. They're drawn to clarity, to consistency, to calm. That's what makes your presence linger in their mind. You're not a storm they have to survive. You're the still water they want to return to. So what does this mean in practical terms? It means stop obsessing over what he's doing, thinking, or feeling. Redirect that focus inward. Cultivate your own presence. Nourish your mind, your body, your spirit. Speak with intention. Move with grace. And above all, live as though your life is enough, with or without his attention. Because the truth is, when you no longer chase love, love finds you in your fullness. And when a man meets a woman who is already full, already whole, already radiant, he doesn't want a piece of her. He wants access to the world she's created. And here's what you leave him with. Not the memory of what you did, but the feeling of who you were. Let that be the craving. When we talk about making someone crave your presence, truly crave it, it's not about manipulation, it's about authenticity. One of the most misunderstood dynamics in attraction, especially in the context of modern relationships, is the role of unpredictability. Now, I don't mean erratic behavior or games or ghosting someone to provoke insecurity. That's not power. That's chaos. What I'm referring to is a kind of psychological asymmetry, a delicate tension between familiarity and mystery that keeps a person curious, engaged, and magnetically drawn to you. Human beings are wired to seek out what is novel yet safe. This is deeply rooted in our evolutionary biology. When something is completely predictable, our brain quickly habituates to it. It stops registering it as meaningful or necessary to focus on. But when something is entirely unpredictable, we experience anxiety because we can't map the pattern, we can't anticipate the outcome, and so we retreat. But when we encounter something or someone who is just unpredictable enough to keep us alert, yet grounded enough to make us feel emotionally secure, that's where craving begins. It's in that space that presence becomes addictive. You want to think of yourself not as a puzzle he can solve in a day, but as a book he wants to keep reading, chapter after chapter. That doesn't mean you should hide who you are. It means you should be so multifaceted, so evolving, that each time he thinks he knows you, he realizes there's more depth to explore. And the only way to genuinely offer that is to actually be that, constantly expanding, constantly growing, constantly surprising even yourself with what you're capable of. That sense of psychological novelty, that tension between knowing and not knowing, triggers dopamine in the brain. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter of craving. It's not the chemical of reward as most people think. It's the chemical of wanting. When your presence consistently activates his curiosity, when you offer emotional depth, intellectual challenge, spiritual insight, or even creative unpredictability, You're engaging his mind in a way that forms deep, lasting attachment, not just attraction. Attachment. And here's the philosophical layer that most people miss. Craving isn't just about chemistry, it's about meaning. When a man feels that being around you expands his view of the world, challenges his complacency, invites him into growth, he doesn't just desire you, he respects you. And when respect enters the emotional equation, the desire becomes less about ego and more about essence. He wants to be near you not because you validate him, but because you elevate him. Let's bring this into real-world terms. This means you don't reveal everything in the first few dates or even the first few months. You let conversations unfold. You share your layers over time. You surprise him, not with drama, but with depth. One day, it's a thought-provoking insight about a book you read. The next, it's your unexpected talent for music or your quiet discipline around personal goals. It's the blend of consistency and surprise that makes your presence feel irreplaceable. So many women, driven by fear of losing someone, put all their cards on the table too quickly. But what they fail to understand is that when you give someone everything too soon, you rob them of the joy of discovering you. And discovery, that process of unveiling, is what sustains emotional engagement over time. Don't be a one-act play, be a story worth staying for. A presence he can't predict, but always wants more of. And remember this, when you live a life that even you find fascinating, others can't help but feel drawn to your orbit. Not because you're trying to be desired, but because you've become deeply, irresistibly engaging. Craving isn't created by trying harder, it's created by becoming someone who never stops unfolding. One of the most powerful, yet often misunderstood forces in human attraction is absence. Not indifference, not emotional unavailability, which is a form of avoidance, but intentional absence. The kind that signals self-respect, independence, and an unwillingness to be defined solely by another person's attention or approval. This is not about punishing someone with silence or withdrawing out of spite. It's about making your absence just as meaningful as your presence. And when it's done from a place of inner strength, it leaves a psychological imprint that is almost impossible to ignore. You see, we live in a culture that glorifies constant connection. Texting all day, instant replies, oversharing on social media. We're conditioned to believe that love means availability, constant emotional accessibility. But what if I told you that the most memorable people aren't the ones who are always around, but the ones whose absence matters? The ones who make you notice the emptiness in the room when they're not in it. That's when you begin to crave someone, not simply because of what they give you, but because of what you feel when they're not there. This is grounded in a basic psychological principle. Contrast heightens perception. We only recognize light because we've seen darkness. We only value warmth because we've known cold. And we only long for someone when we feel their absence. If you're always available, if you're always offering your time, your attention, your emotional labor, you become part of the background like white noise, familiar, comfortable, but forgettable. Now, when you learn to retreat intentionally, not to manipulate, but to recenter yourself, you change the dynamic entirely. You're no longer reacting to his energy. You're no longer scrambling to maintain closeness. You're rooted in your own ground, creating space that he now feels compelled to fill. Why? Because human desire operates in cycles. We chase, we grasp, we pause, we reflect. And in that space of reflection, when you're not present, he starts to remember, to revalue, to reevaluate. The mind begins to romanticize, to reconstruct, to imagine. That's when craving is born. And here's the part that requires the most discipline, but also generates the deepest respect. When you create distance and you don't reach out, don't explain yourself, don't seek reassurance, you communicate a powerful message. I don't need to chase you to know my worth. That energy, silent, calm, detached from desperation, is magnetic. It tells a man, consciously or unconsciously, that you are not an emotional commodity. You are not available on demand. You are a person with structure, with boundaries, with dignity. Philosophically speaking, this touches on something deeper, the nature of longing itself. Longing doesn't arise from saturation. It arises from absence, from the gap between what is and what was. And when you become someone who doesn't overexpose herself, when you understand the emotional economics of space, you become unforgettable. This doesn't mean playing hard to get, it means being hard to forget, because your presence was meaningful and your absence even more so. And that can only happen when you've cultivated a life, a rhythm, and an identity that is rich with purpose, even when no one is watching. So the next time you're tempted to overextend, to always be available, to respond immediately, to prove your value through presence, pause. Ask yourself, what would happen if you stepped back with grace? What would happen if you allowed your silence to speak? Because sometimes it's not the words you say or the time you give that makes him crave you. It's the quiet confidence in your distance, the kind that leaves him wondering, remembering, and wanting more. Never underestimate the power of absence when it's backed by a life full of presence. One of the most underestimated dimensions of attraction is what I'd call emotional mystery. And it's not mystery in the sense of being confusing or evasive, it's not manipulation, it's a deeper concept, one rooted in restraint, in subtlety, in a kind of selective self-revelation. It's the capacity to hold back just enough of yourself so that the other person is drawn forward. Curiosity, after all, is one of the most powerful motivators of human behavior. When someone feels they haven't figured you out, they continue to engage, not because you're playing a game, but because there's genuine depth they've yet to explore. Think about the psychology here. We are wired to pursue that which holds our attention. And attention, especially in romantic dynamics, is sustained not through oversharing or emotional dumping, but through the artful balance of expression and restraint. When you reveal everything, your thoughts, your plans, your feelings, you flatten the terrain, you become predictable. There's no longer a reason to wonder what you're thinking, what you're feeling, what you might do next. And without that wonder, desire begins to erode. Now, this isn't about being cold or detached. It's about being intentional. When you leave space between what you feel and what you express, you create a sense of tension. And that tension, in a healthy dose, is electric. It's what makes a man lean in. It's what compels him to ask more questions, to study your expressions, to tune into the subtleties of your communication. He starts to crave the insight, the emotional access. Not because you've withheld affection, but because you haven't laid yourself bare for the sake of approval. There's a deeper philosophical truth here as well. Human beings are meaning-making creatures. We seek narrative, we seek coherence, but we are most engaged when there are gaps we have to fill in ourselves. When something is too obvious, too available, too explained, it loses its sacredness. Mystery protects the sacred. It allows you to be known over time, layer by layer, rather than consumed all at once. And in a world of instant gratification, that slow reveal is not only rare, it's irresistible. There's also a power dynamic at play. When you feel the urge to constantly explain yourself, to clarify your intentions, to prove your emotional purity, you're placing your emotional validation in someone else's hands. You're saying, please understand me so I can feel okay. But when you are secure enough to let someone wonder, to let them sit with their uncertainty, you're holding your ground. You're not flinching in the face of ambiguity. And that signals a level of maturity that's deeply compelling. This is especially important in relationships where intensity builds quickly. Emotional transparency is vital, but it must be earned, not handed over on a silver platter. Otherwise, it loses value. A man should feel that your inner world is something he has to slowly earn access to, not because you're closed off, but because you know your value, because you recognize that not everyone is entitled to your soul just because they're interested in your body. And here's the paradox. The more you honor your own emotional privacy, the more others begin to honor it too. The more you trust in your own depth, the more magnetic that depth becomes. It's not aloofness, it's discernment. And that's the kind of energy a man doesn't just desire, he respects it, he craves it. Because he senses that being in your world isn't something casual, it's a privilege. So remember this, when you master the art of mystery, you're not withholding love, you're elevating it. You're inviting someone to rise to the level of your inner world, not dragging yourself down into constant explanation. And that's how you become unforgettable. Not through exposure, but through elegance. If you want a man to crave your presence like a drug, there's one thing you absolutely cannot ignore, and that's your own emotional sovereignty. This is the cornerstone. Because if your emotional state is dictated by his attention, his approval, or his responses, then what you're offering isn't presence, it's dependence. And dependence isn't attractive. It doesn't generate longing. It doesn't produce fascination. It creates pressure. It creates burden. It makes the other person feel like they're responsible for keeping you afloat. And nobody craves what they feel responsible for sustaining out of guilt. So what is emotional sovereignty? It's the psychological posture of a person who knows they can experience deep connection without losing themselves in the process. It's the calm assurance that your well-being, your identity, and your sense of meaning are rooted in something far deeper than whether or not someone texts you back. This kind of stability is magnetic. It's the difference between someone who wants you and someone who needs you. And we all know instinctively what we want excites us, what we need eventually exhausts us. Let me take that further. A woman who possesses emotional sovereignty is a woman who doesn't chase, doesn't beg, doesn't perform for attention. Why? Because she understands the immense value of her presence. And when someone knows their presence is valuable, they don't overextend themselves. They don't scramble to prove their worth. They simply exist in their power. And people feel that. Men feel that. They sense it when you walk into a room. They notice when you're not trying too hard to be noticed. They crave the emotional steadiness you embody because it provides contrast to their own internal chaos. That contrast is important because most men, even high-functioning intelligent men, operate in a constant state of psychological noise. They're under pressure, they're navigating expectations, failures, competition, existential uncertainty. And when a woman enters their world with emotional stillness, not apathy, not indifference, but a quiet inner strength, it's like a balm to the nervous system. He doesn't just like being around her, he needs it because she doesn't add to the chaos, she calms it. She's not seeking validation, she's embodying it. And that kind of presence becomes addictive, not because it feeds his ego, but because it feeds something far deeper, his sense of inner peace. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Emotional sovereignty doesn't mean being emotionally unavailable. That's a common misunderstanding. In fact, it allows you to be more emotionally open because your openness isn't driven by fear. You're not opening up because you're hoping it will keep him around. You're doing it because you choose to, from a place of abundance, not scarcity. And paradoxically, that makes your vulnerability more powerful, not less. It's the difference between someone offering love as a transaction and someone offering love as an expression of wholeness. The latter, that's what we crave. That's what we remember. You see, a man might be drawn to looks. He might be pulled in by charm. But what anchors his desire, what makes him return again and again, is how he feels in your presence. And if your presence is calm, grounded, unapologetically whole, he'll begin to associate you with that feeling. And that's when he starts craving you, not because you're trying to be everything to him, but because you're so deeply yourself. So if you want to be unforgettable, if you want to be the woman whose presence lingers in his psyche long after the conversation ends, don't aim to control him, aim to master yourself. Because the deepest kind of craving a man can feel isn't for a woman who chases him, it's for a woman who doesn't need him to chase her, but who still chooses to meet him there. Let that be your standard. Let that be your power, because that's the kind of presence no man can forget.